Howdy, welcome back to Leah's Leaves. I'm in the garden today. It's a beautiful, cool day in Virginia. We had a heat wave last week, another one is coming. So I'm taking advantage of a day in the 70s with full sun to get out and show you my preferred method of growing indeterminate tomatoes and talk a little bit about tomatoes in general. So come along. This bed has some celery, calendula, a bunch of cantaloupes growing up a cattle panel trellis, and one indeterminate variety of tomato. I want to bring you in close here from where it's planted in the ground. I just have it staked up a single 6-foot bamboo pole at the moment. I will reinforce it as the fruits progress. You notice anything about this? It's that all along the stem for about 2.5 feet, I have cut every leaf and sucker off. That was early in the process. The reason I'm doing this is because I'm training this particular tomato up a single stem. And the reason I do that is even though it might reduce the number of tomatoes I get, it will increase the yield size. It will increase the size of the tomatoes. It will increase the flavor of the tomatoes. I cut the leaves off toward the bottom when I first plant it so that they're not anywhere near the ground to touch it. I cut suckers off or pick them off in the early days of the growth cycle so that I encourage root and leaf development and for the stem to grow taller. And then once the flowers begin forming on the main stem, that's when I'll finally let them grow. So here is a sucker that has blossoms on it. I'm leaving those. That'll be my first official cluster of fruit on this particular tomato. This is my main tomato bed. This is just a 4x4 box. And in it I have several varieties of indeterminate tomatoes and one determinate one. Some of them are growing here up the cattle panel trellis, and they'll meet the cantaloupes in the middle. I'm just going to let them keep growing and growing and growing, and when they reach the top, I'll let them hang down a little bit, and then I'll top them, which means I'll cut off the last flowering growth at the top of the plant in order to discourage it from growing any taller. And that will drive energy back down into the rest of the plant to grow bigger fruits. It'll also prevent it from getting so large and unruly that I can't even pick all of it. In the back, I have a different kind of trellising system. That's just some PVC pipe that's a couple bucks at the hardware store and some tomato netting, or any kind of netting would do. It's not high quality durable netting. I'll have to replace the netting next year, but it's sufficient to stake up the tomatoes in the back there. And then the ones toward the front are growing up bamboo posts. Today I'll be reinforcing those with a second post and creating like a little V-frame for them. This is another example of an indeterminate that's been pruned the same way as the front. This is a Shemeg stew stuffed tomato. When it's fully developed, it'll be a striped tomato shaped like a bell pepper with thick walls and very few seeds inside. It's a new variety that I'm trying this year for the single seed challenge. Down here at the bottom where it's planted, you'll see there's no leaf or sucker growth for the first 1.5 feet. And then I left a sucker on, and it's developing all that fruit. And then another cluster is developing a little bit above it. Isn't that beautiful? It's going to be a gorgeous tomato. I've left a couple leaves toward the top for photosynthesis, but otherwise the stalk is bare. It has all the leaves it needs to photosynthesize. It doesn't need more than that. Any more than that, it would just put energy into the leaf production and not the fruiting. And any more toward the bottom would make the plant more susceptible to disease. This one I'm growing in a 3-gallon bucket, so it's not even a big bucket, but inside the bucket I have a 6-foot stake and a 6-foot bamboo pole, and I'm going to reinforce it with some trellis behind it, which I'll show you in a minute. But these are Gold King of Siberia yellow oxheart tomatoes. Look how beautiful those are. These are going to be the first 4 tomatoes on the vine. They're going to be enormous. And they have this beautiful ox heart kind of teardrop shape to them. And you'll notice that at the bottom, once again, all the leaves are gone, all the way up to where these two clusters begin forming fruit. And the leaves have been pruned off, except for another few clusters at the top. And they're just there lightly. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 actual leaves on this whole plant. And it's all it needs. This is enough leaf development to photosynthesize the plant while keeping most of the growing energy into the stalk and fruit production. Now this is what I'll actually get out of this. I'll have the bottom cluster, which you've already seen. I'll have this one that's forming buds. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 flowers on that cluster. Up here, there is another cluster that's branching out, and it's actually two miniature branches of the same sucker. And it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 flowers on it. And this little one has 2, 4, 6, 8 flowers on it. One of them looks a little wasted. And right here at the top, another flower top is forming with at least 5 flowers that I can see from this angle. So that's going to be quite a lot of tomatoes out of one tall, skinny plant that's been heavily pruned, growing up a couple of stakes in a 3-gallon bucket. Now this tomato, right next to the other one, is actually a semi-determinate variety called Glacier. They make little salad type tomatoes, and I have one here that's ready to pick. And what a semi-determinate is a plant that will grow like an indeterminate tomato, except it will fruit all at once early in the season, and then it will reproduce fruit later in the season. So it's like, instead of growing continuously like an indeterminate, it grows almost like a determinate tomato, but twice or sometimes 3 times in the season. This one has been lightly pruned because it's semi-determinate. I didn't do a lot of heavy pruning because I wanted it to continue developing. But I am going to take this yellow leaf off just by pruning it here. That yellow leaf is not disease. That's just a sign that the fruiting has begun below it, and it has done its job. I'm going to trim this one as well for the same reason. There we go. Still plenty of healthy green leaves to photosynthesize, and we'll pick a tomato today. It's the beautiful thing about this variety is it's bred for cooler climates that have a shorter growing season, so it really does produce fruit very quickly. In a determinate variety like this one, this is a Manitoba, also bred for cooler climates and shorter growing seasons. You don't want to do any heavy pruning at all. You want to keep as many leaves and suckers on as possible, because this plant will fruit once and then be done. It'll have a shorter growing season, a shorter fruit production season. Now if you look closely under here, you will see that I have trimmed off lower leaves, and that was to keep them off the surface of the soil so they don't get splashed on and invite disease. Now we're back to the 4-foot bed. I want to show you one more tomato that is taking over my whole life. This is a Rutgers tomato. It is a determinate tomato, so it also did not undergo heavy pruning. But look at the fruit clusters that are forming under there. And this plant, let me see if I can keep it in the frame of the camera. I'm going to switch hands here for a second. This plant starts way under there by that stake. It branches at the bottom here. I don't know if you can see that, here and here. And then there's a sucker coming right off the first stake. I let that grow too. And then it grew toward the front of the bed over my marigolds. It grew out of the side of the bed onto my yarrow and oregano. And I'm going to have a big job today getting about 5 different stakes and putting stakes in the ground and trellising that thing up and giving it more support. But I'm just going to let it grow. I'm not giving it any heavy pruning. I want as much fruit off of this Determinate tomato as possible early in the season. We'll take Holly, the garden gnome, inside for a minute. She was getting hot out in the sun. There you go, buddy. I'll show you my trellis that I'm going to put behind those buckets. But first, I wanted to talk about this grow bag for a second. This is just a fun little story. This is the beauty of growing. If you're watching gardening videos because you're thinking about starting a garden, then let this inspire you. Yesterday, my mom and her fiance were going to have dinner together, and she wanted to make ham pot pie, which is a favorite of ours from back in Western Pennsylvania. I live in Virginia now. So every once in a while, she whips up some comfort food, and she wanted to make that for him. And she said she was gathering all her ingredients, and she said, "You don't happen to have any potatoes that you could harvest for tonight's dinner? Otherwise, I'll go to the store and buy some." And I was like, "I don't know, let me go check." So I came out here to this grow bag, pulled out the plant that was toward the end of its growing cycle, and pulled out 7 beautiful new potatoes that we cooked up in the ham pot pie. It was delicious. It's just a wonderful thing to be able to walk outside in the middle of preparing dinner and say, I think I want some cilantro in my meal, and go cut it. Or, ooh, this basil would be good with this. Or, I'm going to go check if that tomato that was starting to gain color is ripe enough to eat yet, and come out and grab it. I'll show you this beautiful little tomato plant. This is a Tiny Tim tomato. This is a dwarf variety of cherry tomato that you can grow in any container or patio container. It's a very small, compact plant. It won't get any more than about 22 inches tall. And mine is starting to produce fruit and flowering. And I have some snapdragons next to it, and the bees have been around pollinating, and it's doing really well. The beautiful thing about dwarf tomatoes is that you can grow them any time of year. You can grow them indoors under a good light or a west or south facing window, even in the off season. They just need to have enough light, and they need a big enough pot for good root development. So I'm bringing you over here to show you this trellis. I'm going to drive 2 T-posts into the ground and then zip tie this trellis to it a few feet off the ground, so that when it's done, the top of the trellis will be about maybe 9 feet off the ground. And that's what those indeterminate tomatoes in the buckets are going to continue growing up after they've reached the top of their 6-foot stake. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed seeing tomatoes and my preferred method of pruning indeterminate varieties. Again, an indeterminate tomato is a tomato that you will plant, and it will produce fruit all the way up until you either top off the last bit of flowering to prevent it from growing further, or when it hits frost and undergoes a cold weather snap that kills it. A determinate variety is one that you will plant. You won't heavily prune it at all, other than maybe just taking off the bottom leaves. You'll let it grow its life cycle, and it will produce 1 large crop of fruit within about 3 to 5 weeks. And when that first and only crop of fruit is finished, that plant is done. You can pull it out of the ground and replace it with a new start. So if you're growing determinate varieties now, and you haven't started determinate tomatoes indoors, you could actually start some short day varieties like Glacier, Manitoba, some the Tiny Tim tomatoes, for example. And in 2 months' time, when your determinate tomatoes are done producing, you can replace them with a late season crop. And even if the frost comes, if you're able to just cover those for the cold nights, uncover them during the day. In my area, for example, here in Zone 6B in Luray, Virginia, we frequently will have a frost or freeze in early to mid-October, and then the temperatures will warm up again to the 80s. So if I can protect my tomatoes just for a few nights of chill, peppers, eggplants, all of those plants qualify. then I can actually extend the season well beyond my first frost, just with a little of preventative measures, okay? Last thing I'll show you are a couple other ways I'm growing tomatoes this year. Again, just for inspiration and just to remind you that plants want to grow. They want to grow. If you give them the conditions, they will grow. So check this out. Some of my indeterminate tomatoes, when I was planting them out, I was just running out of room, but they had such beautiful suckers on them that I thought, well, I can't throw those away. If I can figure out how to get them to grow more fruit, I will. So this is a recycling bin from the town of Luray that I wasn't using. And so I filled it. It has a crack in the bottom. So that's my drainage. That's why I wasn't using it, because it had this big crack in the bottom. So I just filled it with potting mix and amended it with some fertilizer. And I put 2 tomatoes in the corners and 1 in the middle. And look at them. All of them are thriving. They're thriving and they're going to grow food for my family. And look at this one over here. This is my compost bin. I had extra suckers, but I also had some soil that I was throwing back into the compost to amend for next year. And so I decided to lay these tomatoes on their side and cover them with more of that refurbished soil. And look, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1 over here, 5 tomatoes growing in a pile of decomposing vegetation outside next to where I park my car. I mean, those plants want to grow. And if you give them some soil, some light, and water them occasionally, they will grow and they'll be just fine. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Give a like, a thumbs up, share it with your friends or on your page. I'm Leah's Leaves. I'm learning a lot and I'm sharing it here. I hope you'll come grow with me. Bye.